All right, so next we have I feel like it's becoming kind of our traditional, our infamous, I'm not sure what we call this session, but our quarterly market update. And we're going to be joined on stage as we're getting ourselves set up here. We're going to be joined on stage, helping us out today a little more so than what we've had previously, is Senior Research Scientist at MIT, Chris Caplice. We have Senior Economist Mazen Danif, SVP of Consulting Ben Cubitt, and SVP of Data Science and Engineering Matt Harding. Thank you.
Taking care of business.
Middle.
Taking care of business.
We have the right order?
Taking care of business.
Hi, everybody. We didn't pick that walk-up song. We wanted what? It's the end of the world.
It's the end of the world as we know it.
They didn't give us that. So, hi, I'm Chris Caplice. I'm the Executive Director of MIT's Center for Transportation and Logistics. I'm also the Chief Scientist at DAT, Freight and Analytics. And I'm excited to be here and honored to be here on the stage with these guys. As everyone in this room knows, freight transportation is really complex. And what makes it really interesting and unique, and why we're all here, is that because it's end-to-end, it touches everything. It's impacted by everything, and everything impacts it. And so to get a full understanding of the freight market, you've got to look not just at the freight market, but beyond. And so you need different perspectives. And that's what I love about this group, is we have three very different perspectives from three experts, all within Uber or legacy Transplace, depending on who you talk to. So let me go and introduce the panel, and then I'll explain how we're going to proceed. So first, I'm going to have Dr. Mazen Danif, who's a senior economist and applied scientist. I have to make sure I read the title right, at Uber Freight, where we were colleagues up at MIT, where we both got our PhDs. And he's going to talk about a big overview of market forces, kind of the big things that can affect the freight transportation market. And then following will be Matt Harding, who I've known for 30 years now, 25 years. We both had hair back at that time when we first met. He's going to talk more about the data and kind of tie things together and see how things fit. And then at the end is Ben Cubitt, who I've known for just slightly under 10, 15, 20 years. And he's going to give us kind of that practical perspective, the real experience that you guys are seeing out in the market and kind of bring things together. And so here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to turn it over to them one at a time and give them 4 to 5 minutes, no slides. And so they're just going to talk about what they think is going to happen in the next few quarters, Q4, and then the first half of 2023. Then I'm going to do some questions that I will have, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone here. Please use the app for putting in questions, and then also if you could upvote the ones you want to hear. That would be great. I won't listen to what you say, but at least you get to give input. How's that? But then in addition to that, there will be a poll in a second, and I'm going to open that now. So you'll have a poll, and we just want to get some questions for that. All right, so that's how we're going to proceed. Love to get your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. But let me turn it over to you, Mazen, and give us your thoughts on the overview of the larger market.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. So we've seen a couple of very volatile years since 2020. We've seen the record increase in spot rates 2020, followed by a record decrease in spot rates in 2022. So what are we expecting next? I think currently we're entering a period where demand is stagnating, whether we look at consumer demand, manufacturing demand. So I'm picking my words carefully because I'm saying stagnating, probably not increasing, not decreasing. That's what we're seeing. And at the same time, we're starting to see the market getting somewhat oversupplied with drivers, especially on the truckload market, long-distance truckload market. So what we're seeing because of that is that spot rates are falling. A lot of volume is moving from the spot market to the contract market, and that's why we're seeing this softness nowadays. I expect this to continue throughout Q4. I expect to see a muted peak season that will last probably until Q1 next year. But we all know the market is cyclical, so at some point it will start going up. Now, what do we need for the freight market to start going up again? I think we'll need one of two things, either a reduction in supply, which is driver supply, whether it's drivers or owner-operators. We need to see a reduction to see that tightening. Or we need to see contract rates start going down, because it's all about that differential between the spot market and the contract market. Right now, it's at a record level, and that's why we're not seeing tender rejections. All of the volume is on the contract market. So once we see the contract rates started going down, we'll see more tender rejections, more volume on the spot market, and that will trigger like a cycle. So I expect that to happen maybe sometime late next year, but until then, I expect to see the soft market.
Do you have a date?
I don't have. I wish I had.
I wouldn't be. Day when that's going to happen. May 15th. No.
I wouldn't be here if I had one.
Okay. All right, Matt.
All right. Well, we've been talking to a lot of customers through our QBRs, and we get the question, what's going to happen. I think up until about 3 days ago, I thought it was going to be pretty calm. But the fact that the rails are having issues, the fact that the markets, if you look back the last 20 years of watching freight, it moves on it's very cyclical, maybe 9 to 18 months, things change. Just the advent of Uber Freight and the technology that enables drivers to quickly go out when there's money to be made and kind of tap into a tight market. The structural aspects of, when you look back at FEMA and you look back at COVID, there's some parallels, I think, to our jobs in terms of how we deal with this volatility. So it's very hard to kind of predict or counter these. I think having resilient plans, what we're seeing with our customers is to be able to adapt quickly is really the key thing. We're going to be consistently measuring it with Mazen's assistance. We've got a track on information that's really going to round out our understanding of what's happening. But I think the big thing for me is just the last couple of years don't really reflect anything we've seen in the last 20, just in terms of that volatility. And that really puts pressure on getting the most out of technology, having processes. You can't go through COVID as a nation and say, let's forget everything we just learned, right? So those questions about having task force and having that energy focused on that volatility, that's key, and I think that's where we're headed. Some key unexpected outcomes, I think, over the last couple of years that I've seen that are worth noting is that you look at the challenges with components and supplies on the Class 8. That was a direct driver of owner-operators going out and making, as leaving fleets, going out into the market to make spot premiums. And then we saw the Ukraine and the fuel crisis carve into those margins for those owner-operators, and now they're fleeing back, right? So the idea that there's a driver shortage, there's this systemic crisis, it's really a pendulum that swings between people that are very opportunistic, just as we all are as shippers and as carriers. When there's opportunity, we're going to take advantage of that. So my big takeaway is that how that moves quickly, you have to really be ingrained to the data, be ingrained to what people are seeing from a process and technology perspective and how to align. In terms of a forecast, this rail thing is a big deal. It will have implications on manufacturing. We're going to talk about it a little bit later. I want to jump ahead. But I do think watching what the spot market does when these shocks occur will sort of indicate the level of preparedness you need to hit your budget, right? So right now it seems smooth sailing towards the end of the year. If you're in the spot market, depending on the mode, it's going to give you some benefit. We always try to align the strategy of our customers to those opportunities, but we are seeing a very soft spot market right now with good opportunity. I would think that going into Q1 of 2023, the question in my mind is how far can consumers go? We've seen a lot of 5x the stimulus in the economy versus the mortgage crisis. So a lot of consumer behavior kind of tapping into that, and we got a demographic that's really large in those prime ages. So at some point that's going to have to come back a little bit, and I think the Fed's going to drive that. So I would expect a fairly, if I had to put my name on it, a flatbed is a good one going into the first half of next year, but beyond that, given the swings that we've seen, you really have to kind of track to the market and prepare yourself for what's, anything that can happen. So.
All right. Before I turn it over to Ben, though, remind everyone to do the survey, the polls. They're open. Do that, and we'll talk about it. But let me turn to you, Ben.
Thanks, Chris. So September 2022, right? It's been an interesting couple of years, to put it mildly. So where do we go from here? What do we do? Those are the big questions. One thing I can tell you is we're probably going to continue to have supply chain disruptions, right? Ocean is still ocean, port congestions, threatened rail strike, Rivers so low in Europe that they're finding Roman cities that have been hidden for 2,000 years. What does that mean from a supply chain perspective? It means barges can't go freely up and down the Danube and the Rhine and other rivers. You know, who expected that, right? It's always something. Talk to a lot of people here about plants. If you're running manufacturing plants, you're still having trouble getting labor. Still having trouble getting labor in DCs. Those cause supply chain challenges. What Mazen said is very important. So as we look at the market and we do a market outlook, you know, where's demand? It's stagnant. It's not down. And it was strong. The U.S., North America is still the growth engine, the real only part of the global economy that's growing. And so demand's decent. What's one thing we know? Driver supply is better. We've been doing a carrier survey. We go out to small, medium, large carriers. We get a good response rate. We did it in July this year, and it was really interesting, you know, and I was really waiting to see that survey response come back. And what it told us was two things. It said driver count is up. So we looked at that, 60% of the carriers said driver count was up, 20% said flat, 20% said down. Of those that were up, the biggest band was 10 to 15% up. Not 2 or 3%, 10 to 15% up, and quite a few were more than that, 15 to 20% up. So there's more drivers. Seated percentage, back up around 93, 94%, only 7% empty trucks. It had got below 85%, so carriers had 15% of their trucks empty. So that's a big input on supply. The last thing we know is shippers, you're all tired of being on the treadmill of just every day, Groundhog Day, finding capacity, going home tired. You know, it's a little bit better. So now people are starting to look out over the horizon. They're working on strategy. Network optimization projects. We'll probably help shippers do 40 network studies this year. Historically, 10 or 15. You're trying to increase your weight per truck. You're trying to improve your planning. So unlike other kind of swings of the cycle that we've seen, people aren't focused just on rates. You know, probably going to try to claw back a little bit on rates, but they're also focused on improving those inefficiencies in carriers' networks, shippers' networks, and in the supply chain.
Great. All right, so I'm going to close the polls. And do we get to show those on the screen or something?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Maybe not. So I will tell you what happened. Yeah, so has your demand changed from last year? How has your demand changed? And it's the big one is increased slightly, 31%, increased significantly, 21%, but almost a third also said decreased slightly. So it's all over the board. So what does that tell you?
Right, so what it tells me is that there's an existing narrative that inflation is taking demand down, and that's why we're seeing the spot market. I think we can safely take that off the table. So we're not seeing this demand falling off a cliff scenario that many are talking about in the media.
Yeah, so it's not the same. There are different industries I think are affected very differently. Can we go to the next polling one? Can you guys do that? Yes, no? Do I have to do something? Technology. Once you turn 60, it's all foreign to me. There we go. Okay, so kind of like Goldilocks, right?
Yeah.
Just too high, just right, and now people are voting. Awesome. So again, what do you think? What's your takeaway?
What I think is that, yeah, we're seeing this in the market. We're seeing this especially with the demand of big companies. Like we've seen that with Target, with Walmart, with a lot of companies, some issues there, and a lot of retailers as well, so they're not alone. I think we all planned that what we've seen last year in terms of demand would continue to go up, and it wasn't the case. So it really stagnated. So it's not really going down. We expected it to go up, which were, like a lot of us were very optimistic about that. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. So we're stuck with a lot of inventories now, which might be something temporary in my mind, because like inventories are a cycle. So as long as demand is still strong, we should normalize soon.
But not all inventory is the same, right? Right, Ben? So I'm going to direct this to you. So if I'm a retailer and I have excess inventory, I can sell it. But if I'm a manufacturer and I'm missing a component, so my car is missing, you can't sell a car with 3 wheels, right? And that inventory is kind of captive. So have you seen the difference here between the difference inventory where you're stuck?
Yeah, we really are. And, you know, so retailers, if you talk to folks running warehouse capacity was already tight. They're putting that in warehouses, right? And they can put it in a warehouse, and they've got a decision. Do I put it in a warehouse or do I fire sale it? Pretty big decision. And then from a manufacturing, it's all over the board. We have a lot of customers who can't meet demand. The number of people who've told me, and we won't ask you to raise hands, but we had a 5-year plan. We exceeded it in the first year. I mean, there's been some crazy stories. But some of the folks, some of the durable goods, and that's the durable goods is what the Fed has in their target. They want to drive that down, and some of those folks have excess inventory. And again, they're trying to find warehouse space. They're trying to do different things. I won't call out the actual things, but there's some things that you really had trouble getting. Now, if you go to the stores, you can find it. So it really is industry by industry, and there still are. Even though the shortage economy's gone, Chris, their automotive is still way below a traditional build rate. The dealers' days inventory on hand is just at an historic low, as anybody knows. So there's a lot of pent-up new car demand out there that still has to come back.
So let's flip to the market. Now, Matt, let me ask you, this truckload market has been inverted since April, which means the average spot rate is below contract, which is pretty rare, and it's by a significant amount. Does that surprise you, and what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you take forecasts that come from the industry and you put them into a calendar on the date it's supposed to happen, it's a real good way to kind of figure out where the good forecasts are, and that process kind of doesn't yield many results. So I think for us, what was very telling is we track the contract rates. And you think about all the mini bids that come into the business through 2021, all the new contracts that have to go in, try to get the system functioning on a scaled, automated level with those route guides. There's a premium that kind of goes into that rate because the rates that you had weren't getting the capacity and you kind of have to go up. So what happens is, as you track that to a common baseline, you can get a sense of inflation just for route guide rates that need to be in the system. And with the spot premiums being anywhere from 30, 40, 50, 60%, it's a distribution. Some, like 10% are double, 10% are at parity, but there's sort of a normal curve that moves up. That pressure from the spot market to try to get that volume back into the contract side so that you can just automate your TMS comes with a premium. And that rate was anywhere from, depending on the mode, van reefer was like 1.5, 2 points a month. Now, when Ben and I did scenario planning in 2019 for one of our big soup manufacturers, we had scenarios, worst case 5%, best case 1% for the year. And then we're talking 1.5 to 2 per month. So when you have that sustained inflation rate from mid-year 2020 all the way to the end of 2021, and somebody says, what's going to happen next year? Well, there's going to be continued pressure until we get the trucks off the line. The Class 8s can come in and alleviate that. What I didn't see, and I don't think anyone saw, was when Ukraine hit and the energy markets went crazy, all of those owner-operators that were making a ton of money in the spot market suddenly had a $1,000, $1,500 per week fuel bill that they didn't have before if you just net out the rate per mile for the cost of fuel. And suddenly that becomes less attractive. At the same time, the Class 8s were coming off the line. The shortages on equipment weren't as bad. And so the asset providers were there to sort of take the labor, the new trucks, and start being more responsive to those rates. So I don't know how you predict those types of forces. You know when they're coming. We had a great discussion this morning about supply overshooting demand. Demand's flat. We know the supply. It's a slow-moving. It has momentum behind it because it takes so long to seat drivers and get trucks in place that when it overshoots, the next shoe to fall is likely, if demand doesn't change, some form of calibration to the capacity in the other way so that it aligns with the prices. How soon that happens, I don't know, but that's the next part of the phase. The question is it a soft landing, as they say in economic terms, or is it going to be a hard landing that, by the middle of next year, if things don't get good on the demand side, do we start seeing bankruptcies and some of the other things that happen that are very typical to these more macro level cycles?
So Ben, building on that, even though we have a softening market, right, we're definitely turning the curve. Spot rates have certainly dropped, and contract rates are following as well as bids come in. They don't come as continuously as spot rates will change. But carriers have had record ORs, operating ratios. It was ridiculous. Didn't Old Dominion had like in the 60s? Wasn't it? It was ridiculous. And so how is that affecting what shippers are doing now? How's their behavior changing?
Yeah, so you have to separate LTL from truckload. So LTL is kind of, I call them, they're the new railroads, right? There's few of them. They kind of have an infrastructure. You got to use them. Nobody wants to be the biggest LTL carrier. Everybody wants to be Old Dominion. They want to have great yields. So the LTL carriers are definitely doing well, and they're pricing aggressively, and they have tremendous price discipline. So then if you turn over to the truckload market, must be the same way, right? Every truckload carrier must just be a wash and cash. I really encourage you, if you haven't, look at the Q2 earnings of the largest truckload carriers. Look at your publicly traded carriers. What you'll see is the carriers that traditionally operated well and had low ORs and were profitable, they're making money. Those carriers that struggled, kind of a mid-90s OR, they made a little bit of money, could have been quarter to quarter, they're still struggling, but they're doing better, right? They're okay. But then some of the folks who struggled to make money still struggle to make money. And so when you look at it, I'll just give you some examples. Werner revenue was up 29%, earnings were up 3%. Okay, but when you really dig into it, they had 2 large accident settlements. This insurance risk is real. So they had 2 large accident settlements that really hurt their earnings for the quarter. If you look at U.S. Express's revenues were up 14.6, not as strong as Werner's. Their profits were actually $900,000 versus 8.7 the prior year, 8.7 million. And they reported things like lower utilization and fuel expense. And so then the Old Dominion of truckload, Heartland Express just did tremendous, right? Their profits went from 27 million to 105 million. And Heartland is reinvesting that. They bought CFI, they bought Smith Transport. So those high service, high cost truckloads, if they're in your route guide and they fit, they're great. Heartland, CFI, Smith, all part of the same company. Then you look at Schneider. Schneider's kind of in the middle. Their revenue was up 20%. Their income was up 40%. But you really have to drill down into it. Where'd they make their money? Did they make their money in truckload? Did they make it in brokerage? Did they make it in intermodal? So it's just not a flat story. And then the last one, USA Truck. USA Truck's recently been acquired. The revenue was up 37%. They did make money. They made about $900,000 versus losing money the prior quarter. So, just a carrier by carrier, mode by mode story. So is there some exuberance? Is there some earnings uptick? There is, but every carrier is not up double digits. And it's really an interesting story to look at. I think shippers know that. Shippers also know that, if you look at that, every carrier's revenue just about is more than their earnings increase because, carriers have seen a tremendous labor, equipment, cost increases.
So let me go back to the big picture. And Mazen, can you give us some insights on what concern the consumer and manufacturing demand and how that's going to reflect and impact the freight market?
Yeah, so these are the biggest 2 sectors that will affect our dry van market and our reefer market. We'll talk about flatbed and railroad later, but these are the 2 big sectors. So when we look at consumer demand, our best data source out there, it's all, everything that I'll discuss today is public data, so you can all take a look at it. So the best indicator for consumer demand is what's published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. That's consumer spending on durable goods, non-durable goods. And when we talk about consumer spending, we talk about real spending, which is adjusted for inflation. So we're taking out inflation off the picture, and we're looking at what's the closest thing to the actual goods that are moving on trucks. So what we've seen in the recent 2 years was that COVID really has blown up demand by 15%, 20%. So that's how much it increased. The peak was in March, April last year when people received their stimulus checks and then they went on a shopping spree. And since then, it has come down slightly, but has stagnated since then. So we're still seeing a very strong level of consumer spending on durable goods and non-durable goods. Even though durable goods should be sensitive to economic downturns, we're not seeing that yet. We're still seeing this strong spending. Whether that will continue or not, I'll leave it to the next session, the economic outlook. On the manufacturing side, it's almost a similar story. When COVID started, we've seen a 20% decrease in manufacturing output, but then we have seen a very strong recovery since then, a very steady recovery throughout last year, and now it's starting to stagnate. Manufacturing output is starting to flatten out, but nothing is falling off a cliff, as I said before.
Okay, so let me turn back to you, Ben, and then I'd like your opinion on this, Matt. There's been some recent talk in the press of carrier bloodbaths and shippers' revenge. And so tell me, what are you seeing with your customers and your clients? And Matt, what are you seeing in the data? Ben.
Yeah, you know, we had a lot of, Matt and I and Frank and some people, we were on an email exchange over the last couple of days because there was an article came out talking about shippers' revenge, and we were over the weekend emailing back.
Can you feel the revenge from the room? I can feel it, right?
And, you know, it's just not what we see. Are there a small number of shippers that are trying to drive to the, when we do bids now, you know, Matt talking about scenario review, you know, we see a low-cost scenario with some pretty big numbers. And we see most shippers settle somewhere significantly below that because everybody's been through a period of capacity. We see what's, you know, potential rail situation, which could change all the dynamics. So I think most shippers are glad that their foundation is stronger. They can focus on carrier performance, focus on carrier partnerships. So they're keeping that core carrier. They're looking for a little bit of rate relief because there is that opportunity, but they're not chasing the last dollar. I don't see a revenge thing at all. Matter of fact, I see more shippers talking about shipper of preference and still working with their plants, and that's where the work needs to be. So people are starting to move from platitudes to real work in the DCs and the plants, and you know, with the facility data we're getting from Uber, we're starting to work with folks like Coke to tie that facility data back. So I don't see shipper revenge. I see shipper calm acknowledgement that, you know, profits probably got a little bit ahead and we can take some of that back. But as one shipper, a very large shipper, told me, you know, getting ready for this, I pinged them and just kind of checking somebody outside our network. They said, we're really educating our C team that we're not going back to 2019 rates. Yeah, we're going to get some relief, but we also need to work on network inefficiency. So that's where we see it. I don't think we see shippers building a model saying, I need to take, you know, 14.2% out of everybody's pocketbook.
Matt, what do you see in the data?
From a sort of a experiential position, let's say for theoretical or philosophical pondering here, and I'll tie this to a real story so it won't be too theoretical, but let's say you have a $5 to $10 million relationship with a national carrier, and you've benchmarked that information and you find out that those rates are on par 15% less than the market. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I can tell you when the markets start tightening, that capacity has a lot more value to that carrier than it does in your network. And so losing that kind of a relationship on short notice is very disruptive. It leaves a lot of mess from a service and procurement and everything else that comes behind that. So what I would say is that what the data is telling us is that the bids are coming in a little bit more aggressive in terms of cost savings. We're off very high numbers from a year ago before. Negotiate at your peril, right? There is a safe place to be within a relative level of procurement, you know, tour de force to get the rates down. But being really successful in that regard, you might have a sort of a hand grenade that you're not even aware of. So it's good to be fair. You know, to tie it into what we do in our business, we have daily benchmarks on a contract basis that we track, and we can tell you exactly how far is too far. Now, if you go in the spot market, maybe in certain market cycles that's fine, but in other times it's not. So I think there's something to be said for the force that is the market, having visibility to that, and then aligning around that in a way that makes sure that you've got continuity in your business and you weren't so successful that you actually failed. So.
Do you think shippers learned from, because after 2018, when, you know, the famous philosopher Mike Tyson said, you know, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, and they got punched in the face in 2018. Yeah. But they didn't, 2019 was like, forget that stuff. Who needs to be a shipper of choice? But now they got punched twice.
Well, you know, I'll say one thing, Chris. I am surprised how often some shippers go back to the old playbook. And what I mean by that is we see bids where people invite 100 new carriers, and in the first 2 minutes of the scenario review, they eliminate 98 of them. You know, and so it's hard for a lot of shippers to add carriers, and so we see some shippers going back, I'm not adding carriers. We saw a lot, and I was very concerned about it. You know, we do 400 bids a year, and I sit in a ton of scenario reviews, and we saw people saying, I can reduce my carrier base, and you could reduce it from 100 to 60, you know, and everybody kind of wanted to do that. Well, guess what? Everybody was kind of using the same 60 carriers, so when demand exploded and all those things, you know, people were left without a chair. So I think people learn, and there's some learning, but I have been a little surprised how quickly some shippers go back to that playbook of reducing my carriers, not adding new carriers, you know, things that you as Matt said, you might be too successful and come back to regret it. What are your long-term versus short-term goals?
Yeah, I was going to add a point to that. Gosh, and it just flew my mind. So when I looked at you, and it vaporized. It'll come back to me. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. It's funny. At DAT, we've noticed exactly what you're saying, Ben, that many shippers are finding single-digit reductions, but mainly with their incumbents. And so typically when you want to save money, you go wide, right? You find the new carriers coming in, but you raised a really good point. It's really hard to get them transitioned on and everything. And so I thought it was interesting that shippers tend to be, not all, but most are going deeper. And you think that's the wrong strategy right now? You think they should throw a wider net?
I think all things in moderation. I think there's value to bringing new carriers.
All things in moderation, Ben?
I think most things in moderation.
Moderation and moderation.
I'm okay if the stock market moderates. It doesn't moderate up. I'd like to see up. But I think, Chris, I think when you swing it wildly, I mean, there was real value at adding new carriers. And I think you need, carriers networks changing more than ever, right? I mean, I just can't even imagine being a carrier responding to all these bids, losing freight, gaining freight. So, your people who are stars, we've seen this more. You used to have a carrier in your route guide, and yeah, they got a little bit better, a little bit worse, but it was pretty consistent. Now, somebody who was a shining star for you last year may struggle this year, and it may not be their fault. So I think injecting new blood, I think it makes sense. Now, what we've seen is interesting, Chris, and I'm sure you've seen this, is we've seen some shippers really try to over-award. They get it real, we like this carrier. They had 8 million, let's give them 15 million. Well, that's how we can tell it's not a collapsing market, because the carrier says, whoa, I appreciate it, but I can't double my capacity. So I think doing a little bit more with your assets, being strategic, picking your best partners, but there's value to also having up-and-comers and challengers, as some people call them, new people in your network.
So,
yep,
just
you
to follow
remembered?
up, yeah.
You're getting old, Matt.
I know,
Okay.
thanks. We both are. So,
Not me.
So the notion of shipper's revenge, I think that's really an important thing to unpack, because if I'm a shipper sitting on $100 million of freight and the market softens, I don't need a whole lot of data. I just need to hear my phone going off. And so the idea that the shippers are out there rolling up their sleeves, going crazy, I think there's two sides to the coin. I think there's a concern about where we are from a macroeconomic standpoint, from where we are with a labor standpoint. We've got seated drivers. We're starting to get our capacity. And then the question is, how do we weather the storm? I mean, it's literally a desert between two oases for these trucking companies. They have hard times and good times. And so then when you start looking out into that horizon, things look a little stormy. It's time to go out and call those $100 million shippers, 50 or $10 million plus shippers, and figure out how you're going to get those trucks utilized. So I don't think it's a revenge thing. I think that's more of a clickbait kind of term that's out there to kind of get people's attention. I think it's the invisible hand of economies and how they work, and we're all incented to promote and get value from this thing we work in, and that's just how it goes down. So.
Let me go back to something you raised, Ben. You mentioned one of the challenges that you guys all have in the room probably, and other people, shippers who talk to me, is to managing the expectations of the C-suite. Because they read something and, spot rate's down 40%. Why aren't my rates down 40%? How are you seeing your shipper customers, and Matt, I'd like to get your opinion, and you can come and talk about the big picture too. How are you managing the C-suite? How do you see shippers doing that? Or is that a major hurdle, or is that getting better now?
Yeah, I think that's been one of the great changes. You look at, Matt and the data science investment at Transplace, now Uber. You look at what you've done through your career with DAT and Chain, and we know more than we've known in the past. I think most shippers are much better educated, and because it started with the polar vortex, everybody in supply chain was caught by surprise then. Now COVID, so we always, I've been doing this 30 years. We always wanted a seat at the table, and we got it. It was a hot seat, right? So for self-preservation, we've all got better at educating the C-suite. Certainly, that's something Matt and I spend a lot of time on, and that's something that Darren Meisner and Steve Moore and Jeff Thomas, leaders of our ops team, we really work hard to arm our shippers to educate their C-suite, and we try to do that in more and more modes. Matt's expanded that to all geos, all modes. We really, and I think we had a data-driven decision. If you look at people like Coke and Ecolab, who were on the panel, they both have very succinct, consistent messages. They give their leadership kind of monthly, quarterly, and they tell a story. Here's where the market is. Here's where we are. Here's our risk and options. And back when I was a VP of Transportation at WestRock, we certainly didn't know how we performed. I told my boss I did great, but I had no data to back that up.
But he believed you. He believed you. Matt?
I still think there's improvements there. I think that the perception is getting better. But we do have anecdotal stories of $400+ million shipper expected to budget next year, and this was right after COVID, and the CFO saying, we're not asking you to forecast the economy, just tell us what our trucking budget's going to be. And we came out with our estimate of 15% inflation for the year, and even there were other folks close to us saying, we cannot put that out there. Well, in fact, that's exactly what happened. So we don't control, the market is so fragmented and so diverse. Like I said, trying to get out in front of it is good in the maybe 6-month window, but the key is what are my points? What can I change in my business? How does Uber Freight Transplace support those strategies to adapt and adjust with your technology and your process? And then how do you know what's happening? And so I think between Ben and I, we probably did, I would say at least 20, 30 presentations with C-level folks at these high Fortune 100 companies. And it was more education.
Yeah.
It was more of, this is how things work. And it's not, you get 10% in a soft market, they want 10% the next year, 10% after that, and the market just sort of rejects that with the cycle.
Yeah, Chris, we had a couple sessions where we did like 3 sessions for a company. We did one with like their C-team and leaders. We did the next day with like 100 people, everybody kind of above director level, and then we did a third with some of their customers and vendors. I mean, the amount of education and informing, inside these companies has been unbelievable.
So at CSCMP, I'm going to give a session specifically on things I wish my C-suite knew, because everyone has a war story. So if you have any war stories, let me know. But mainly we've been talking about dry van and reefer, I think, generally, because they're the biggest pieces. But flatbed is a big piece, Mazen. So flatbed doesn't always move in sync with the other markets. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so the drivers are different. The demand drivers are different. So if you look at dry van and reefer, it's consumer spending, it's manufacturing. When you look at flatbed, we're mostly looking at manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, but also the housing market. So flatbed has a very strong Q1. Last year was very strong, but recently it has been very sensitive to mortgage rates, to rising interest rates and mortgage rates. And that's what when we started to see all the housing indicators going down, whether it's new home sales, existing home sales, housing starts, even like the sentiment, home builder sentiment is plunging. So all of this is leading to a softer market in flatbed. And as long as rates remain high, mortgage rates increase, we expect this to continue.
Okay. And the other thing about a lot of drivers, but flatbed especially, is they're not necessarily, a lot of them are small, and they're not necessarily profit motivated. And if you increase their wages by 20%, they'll work 20% less. And I'm curious if you've noticed that in the data at all, Matt. Have you seen that where as rates go up, capacity goes down?
I've seen a lot of, I've seen a very segmented focus on flatbed procurement, particularly in down cycles, which if we're facing one. And this was a huge learning for me. So I came from a truckload procurement bid background, did lots of bids way back in the day. And we had this $500 million flatbed bid that was going out with like thousands of carriers. And it was right after the recession and the housing crisis. And we were seeing, in the truckload sector, we were seeing 58 cents a mile, which is exactly 3 cents more than I was reimbursed for my expense to drive to the airport in my personal car. So put that into context. I mean, it was a very, very bad time for rates. And the strategy was, I can't put these mom and pops and these small companies out of business. Like similar to what we heard about the U.S. government, we need them in the future. So if we get too aggressive, we need to think about what's a reasonable rate just to keep that capacity warm, so we can tap into the future and kind of grow these businesses. So I thought that was very interesting. So flatbed's definitely different. The approach to procurement's different. You don't have bigger fleets. It's typically smaller, and it's just a lot harder job. So
and then if you get to bulk, and we have a lot of shippers who ship bulk, it's not the same story, right? It's and if you're sourcing bulk hazmat, we tried to help somebody source bulk hazmat out of Colorado. That's a challenge. If you want to put an Olympic degree of difficulty on something, that's a tough dive.
So let's talk about, we had the COVID period, and all shippers, most of you guys rebalanced your portfolio, right? If your portfolio is, you got dedicated, you've got contract, and you've got dynamic or spot. And people are using that differently. And during the pandemic, according to numbers by AT Kearney, or just Kearney now, I guess, CSCMP and IHS Market, is that dedicated went up 40%. And for-hire truckload went up about, 13%. So my question is, did you see this, and do you think it's going to rebalance back? Do you think dedicated is going to shrink as the market softens, or what do you think is going to happen? Matt,
In terms of market or in terms of price?
Total revenue. This is the Kearney numbers, and so
Percent of wallet?
Yeah.
Maybe? Percent of a shipper's wallet?
Nope. It's about $320 billion in for-hire truckload, about $80 billion roughly in LTL, and they said it went up from about 305 to about 410, I think, billion in
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's implied cost.
Yeah, when your route guides are struggling, you need captive capacity. So there are a lot of companies out there that are willing to try to pop up a fleet. As we were talking this morning, I don't think I've had more questions about how to start a private fleet in a shipper that didn't have one than I did in 2021, which was really interesting to me. So yeah, the idea of having captive capacity that you can control, that's part of your business, and you're not beholden to other forces out there of, a lot of turndowns in the market. So you tender a load to a carrier and they can't get the appointment, they just get exasperated and send a load back. We saw that as an uptick. We saw a lot of shipping of air, right? The payloads were dropping, so you had this sort of phantom demand on the system as well that was just part of not getting those appointments and shipping what you had versus what was needed. So you need a captive solution for that, and I think that's probably what's driving that.
Yeah,
But are they rebalancing? Do you see it going away?
We do. We're very active. We have a very active dedicated fleet management, number of very large shippers. We've stood up kind of an active fleet management with dashboards. And so now with these lower truckload rates, you're really looking at, does the fleet still make sense? Which lanes fit the fleet? And that can depend on, there's two types of fleets. People who've always had fleets and maybe came into this with long-term contracts, and people who popped up a fleet in, at the height of the market and probably had very high rates. But we see a lot of rationalization, Chris. Does the fleet still make sense? Should I expand it or contract it? Which lanes fit now based on a bunch of factors?
That's a really good point. I think shippers and carriers have gotten much better at segmenting lanes, because not every lane's the same. So let's talk about the opposite end of the portfolio, the spot. It used to be spot was a 4-letter word, and I guess it still is technically. But it used to be I only use spot as a shipper when my routing guide failed, because most shippers would use a coverage policy, their strategy, where if something moved, I put a contract on it, just in case, even though it didn't really happen. Are you seeing a change in that, where people are planning to use spot strategically and not just as a movement of last resort?
Yes, absolutely. I think the whole basic foundation of a bid is a forecasted of requirement need, right? And so wherever that fails, whether it's spotty shipments or unpredictable surges or things like that, spot is a good backdrop there. The market helps in softer times than it does in tighter times, but we've seen a lot of shippers, at least with the engineering team and the work that Ben does, to sort of rationalize, here's an entire network of activity, here's where we are in this environment, and how do you segment the right solution based on the frequency, consistency of those lanes and those volumes. So we do a lot of work in that regard.
Yeah, and it varies. Some shippers are thrilled that asset's working and they're trying to do as little spot as possible, and others are saying, my low volume lanes, I'm going to take them to spot because the spot, is 20% below contract, and I'm going to even pick out some other freight. If I have surge freight, if my commitment with a carrier is 20 a week and I have 40, I may take that to spot because that's a good option for me right now. So a lot of different. It's nice to have options. Right?
But tying back to what you said before for the C-suite, if I plan to strategically use, say, an API connection or something we heard about yesterday, where you're connected in, you know what the price is going to be, it's going to be close to market, it'll be okay, but you don't know with certainty what that's going to be. How hard is that to sell to the C-suite? CFOs hate uncertainty. So how are you selling that? How are you saying it's okay to ride the market instead of getting that contract rate?
Well, if there's savings, if it comes down
so it's
to cost.
good now.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had a humbling moment, Chris. So when I was VP of Transportation at Westrock, I reported to the CFO, and I told him how I was doing this brilliant hedging. I did my bid, and I'm going to use more assets because I don't want to do risk, and I'm balancing this. And he goes, Ben, I think you're pretty smart, but do you really know enough to hedge that? Do you have enough? And it was like, he doesn't just believe blindly that I do. And that's an interesting question. How scientific is your hedge, and what all do you take into it? And I think it's can be more of a business unit question or a plant. Hey, we may do more live. Is that okay with you? But there's opportunity.
All right. So let me go to some of the questions you guys put in. And this is from Roger Seckler. Since making predictions is very difficult, as I highlighted yesterday in my session, what 2 or 3 scenarios do you think shippers should be preparing for 2023? So throw me a scenario, Ben. And then I'll go Matt, and then Mazen, you get to go last because that's hardest.
Yeah, so I think it's a tale of two cities, if you will. First half of the year, second half of the year. I think Matt and I talk about this a lot. Q1's usually softer, so if you believe we're going into the end of the year, I think most of if we were a little bit unsure 3 months ago, I think it's pretty clear with the Fed and everything, we're probably going to be soft through the end of the year and probably soft into early next year. Then it's all the economy. Is it a soft landing or is it a hard landing? If it's a soft landing, housing is still underbuilt. Automotive is way below. So you could have some demand really pick up. And so maybe the second half of the year it gets stronger, or if it's a deep recession, it's the other way. So I think those are the things you're wrestling with. And then I think the scenario is take advantage of the market, but be prepared. We all know, the great market shock was 2 storms in a row. It looks like, we're through a fair amount of the season, but next fall we could, God forbid, have 2 bad storms, and there's not enough drivers to weather that. So I think you have to plan for softer in the first, likely continued softness, but a little bit of a wild card in the second half of the year.
Well, I'm going to go back to 2008 again. One of the things that happened assessing the market after that period was the understanding that in a soft market, it's very easy to allocate, sort of, reduce your carrier base, over allocate, because you're getting clear and present benefit from that. So the scenario I would advise everyone is that when that turns, you don't want to over allocate so much that your plan Bs are difficult to achieve. So find value, but retain the optionality in those decisions. Because what we saw was that the relationships, and we define relationships in terms of tiers of spend. So if a shipper was spending from less than $1 million with a carrier, that was one type of less than $1 million, $1 million to $5 million, $5 million to $10 million, $10 million to $20 million. And there are shippers out there that spend $25 million plus with a single carrier, national carrier. The question is, which one moves the first in terms of price differential? And the over-allocated positions, and if you think about it from a carrier perspective, okay, we need to increase our rates. Where do we start? We go to the top of the list and work our way down because there's this long tail of customers. We'll never get there. So just be mindful that optionality is key, particularly as the opportunity becomes abundant if, in fact, we're in a very, very soft market in 6 months.
Yeah, which segment takes capacity away the quickest and rates up, yeah.
What do you think, Mazen?
So Chris, I think it's about what you were saying yesterday. Let's not think about all the possible things that can happen next year. Let's think about what outcomes can they have. I can just mention 2 of these. For example, we can see a significant reduction in demand due to quantitative tightening or due to inflation, and that can result in a very soft market. But on the other side, we can see a significant reduction in supply due to rising carrier costs and the elimination of a lot of driver jobs, so that can result in a tight market. So let's think of outcomes instead of actual scenarios. But these are 2 possible scenarios that can both happen next
You were
year.
paying attention to my talk yesterday. That's good.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So quick response to this one, and I'll just go down the line. Should shippers institute an annual, a 6-month, a 3-month agreement in 2023? Which makes the most sense? Ben, you can't say you can't say it.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about the death of the annual bid. It's like what they say about democracy. It's the worst form of government other than all the rest. An annual bid's the worst other than all the other options. And that's the way I think an annual bid. And you don't have to take your whole network out, and that's what we're seeing. But an annual bid of a significant part of your network still is what most shippers do, and it's what works. The carriers' network's changing so much, yours is. I think an annual bid with a lot of mini bids is the right way to go today.
So can I summarize what you said? Annual bid.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Matt?
Am I under the same scrutiny?
Two words.
So going back to the data, one of the questions that we try to ask is how effective is an annual bid? And to do that, you know when a rate's established because there's a new line haul with a new carrier on a new lane. So what you can do is aggregate all of that volume to say, okay, for the month of, pick your favorite month, March, this was all new bid volume, because it was on that rate. And then you can measure how much volume you're getting against that rate that was established in that month, because you know the effective date. And then over time, what happens? And there's a nonlinear decay. And so if you think of the half-life, which would be half of the volume that is from that bid in that period, from that annual period, how long does that take? Because that gives you a sense of the efficacy of the bid process. So in an ideal world, you bid out all that volume, and every one of those lane rates never changes, and you get 100% of that volume until you run your next bid a year later. And what we find in tight markets, that half-life can be as short as 2 months. For some CPGs that have really stable networks, that half-life can be about 9 months, which means they're supplanting those rates with mini bids over time, right? So that's the way to look at it. But I don't think any of that matters from the standpoint of why companies do annual bids. They do it because if you're responsible for that spend, and you're the tip of the spear in that organization, SVP, supply chain, what have you, you are required to commit a number to the organization. And so we talk about education with the C-suite, and we talk about being a little more dynamic and playing a little bit more dynamic. That's going to happen anyway. But the reality is the expectations of earnings calls and being public companies, and this is our plan, that's what's causing the annual bid process. And the reality, it doesn't work all that well, but it's for that reason alone, I think that's what's driving it. So I think that it's a combination of, I don't think the annual bids are going away.
Okay.
I think they make sense at that level, but there is going back to the scenarios and the planning and the portfolio, being really good at those different levels of cycles. And most people just bid when they have trouble. You know, you've got a new lane or new business, you got to go out and bid and do many. So there's that churning that just naturally occurs.
Yeah, I agree with what Matt said regarding like the certainty that a lot of us want, but I can see also the advantages of a shorter bid period. Just because
you can't say both.
Yeah,
you're an economist.
No, I'm arguing for
you're
a 6
on the other hand.
I'm arguing for a 6-month bid because if your bid is going online starting like early next year, for a year you're exposing yourself to a longer time horizon starting 2020, like late period of 2023. We all know that the freight market is cyclical, so I think a 6-month bid or a shorter bid will guarantee that the benefit of the short-term benefit of the softer market without exposing ourselves to the market cyclicality.
So do you think the effort to do a bid has gone down, has increased or decreased over the last 5-10 years? Ben?
I think it's gone down. I think it's
so
gone down.
That means it's probably easier to do them more frequent?
Yeah, and to spend more time thinking than just grinding through it. You know, the scenario review process is much more robust. But yeah, but it still takes 10, 12 weeks.
The data's there.
2 weeks.
The process is much better than when we used to have to FedEx diskettes to carriers. So it's gotten a little better.
There was that. I forgot about that.
The data's not really there. I would say the data's not there.
There is data.
There's lots of data. It's a partial view of reality. And the reason why it's difficult is because when somebody's making a commitment to you, you talk about the relationship side of the business and the trust, you need to know that there's something behind that. It is a very transactional process, but where it matters, you have to have that connection with an individual that says, I'm here to be, do what's right and be fair, and those things do matter. So until the data gets really robust in terms of understanding the nature of the outcomes and the data science that needs to go into that, I think there's a huge opportunity there.
But I think that's a great point, Chris. I think the middle part of the bid, the hard work, when we used to ship diskettes, that's easier. So you spend more time on the strategy and more time on carrier alignment. That's what we're seeing. Yeah. Good bids spend more time on that on each side.
Yeah, but one of the things that we came up with at MIT, a doctoral student of mine, Angie Acoccello, she did a study on ghost lanes, and so she found that about 50% of the lanes that a shipper will bid out never materialize. Now, it's very low volumes, but they just don't materialize. And so there's a lot of this You talked about the efficacy there, so there's a lot of challenges with it. But let me change to another topic, because I only have 2 minutes and 41 seconds. Let's talk about railroad. You might have heard there might be a strike. How much could even a 1 or 2 day rail shutdown ripple through the truckload capacity and rates? This is a question from Jeff Staggers.
Yeah,
who wants to hit that?
Yeah, quick comment on that. So we talk about scenario planning. So our capacity teams, capacity services, Uber, we're looking at the rail and we're trying to gear up for that, because we think if the rail does have, and a lot of this gets averted to truckload, you're going to come, you're not going to have route guide coverage. We're there to help. We think partnership pricing is probably the right way to go. Cost plus, we'll buy it as well as we can. But you're going to have to fill those gaps. So it's scenario planning. And I love what Matt said about optionality. Even though it's a softer market, you still need optionality, because as we've proved the last 2 or 3 years, and this rail strike, rail strike and then disrupt the truckload market. So.
I think, just to tag on what Ben's saying, the idea that the strike occurs and it puts a sort of sucks the capacity out of the manufacturing sector. There's the initial issue right now of getting spot to sort of whatever can get taken off the rail and circumvented. But there's going to be a delayed need for additional capacity relative to we've got a vacuum in the chain, and we've got to fill those loads with greater velocity. So as long as that's exacerbated, there'll be whatever the manufacturing delay on the other end of that is going to also create another tightening effect. So it's very disruptive. And I think a lot of those, you think about the rail, you get one container of any sort of chemical, and that has orders of magnitude impact on all other types of production.
Yeah, ripples.
So it's a pinch point that's it's not a good place to be messing with any delay or labor disputes, in my mind.
Yeah, so in rail, we're looking at like 1 million loads per month of intermodal, and another like slightly more than 1 million car loads. We know each car load is like 3 or 4 truckloads, close to that. So the amount of demand is like, let's say 2.5 million loads in total between carload and intermodal. How many long distance drivers we have? According to BLS, we have like about 700,000 of them in the long distance specifically. They're already working 43 hours a week, also according to BLS. So my short answer is that we don't have enough drivers for that. If this happens, we might see a huge increase in spot rates, but hopefully it won't. But the good news is that you're not alone in this if it's happening.
So you can suffer with each other.
Yeah.
It's not pure Schadenfreude. All right, our time is up. Thank you very much. Thanks for the panel. Great job.
Okay. Yep.